This is the last in three sermons on the Ten Commandments. We don't talk about the Ten Commandments other than just to talk about them sometimes. You don't hear sermons preached on the Ten Commandments just a whole lot anymore. We talked about the Ten Commandments, the first four of the Ten Commandments, relating to the God-man relationship. And then the last 6 commandments relate to the man-man relationship, or relationship between human beings. We concluded last week with some things about children obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. And tonight we're going to take one that probably we're going to say, well, you know, that doesn't really apply to me. It's thou shalt not kill. Commandment against murder. And I don't expect that any of us in here are murderers. I don't expect that any of us in here have been thinking about committing murder or anything like that. But Jesus gave us some additional information about this whole idea of the commandment not to kill. I want to mention 2 things in reference to this commandment, 2 basic things. One is that this is not a commandment that has to do with war or with capital punishment. It's the idea of murdering for vengeance sake. And this is found in the 20th chapter of Exodus, the 10 Commandments are. And then in the 21st chapter of Exodus, he talks about the penalty of death to certain people who did certain things. And quite a number of places through the law of Moses, he talks about capital punishment. And that was perfectly legitimate under the law. And yet many times people, when they are when they're opposing the idea of capital punishment, they will say, well, doesn't the Bible say not to kill? Yes, but it's talking about murder. It's talking about the idea of killing for vengeance. There are some interesting things that the Old Testament says about this whole thing of this commandment about killing, commandment about murder. Now, here's someone who kills another person inadvertently. He didn't intend to kill him. There were provisions made under the law of Moses for a person who did that. Now, if you unintentionally killed a member of my family, under the law of Moses, I had the right, as a matter of fact, it was thought of even as a responsibility. I had the responsibility or the right to chase you down and kill you, execute you. The law of Moses provided for that in the book of Numbers. Now, you say, well, but I did it unintentionally. I was not trying to commit murder for vengeance or something like that. Well, the law made provision for that. In the land of Canaan, on each side of the Jordan River, there were 3 cities called cities of refuge. 6 in all, 3 on one side of the Jordan and 3 on the other side of the Jordan. And the person who had the right to execute you would be called the avenger of blood. That's what the Bible calls him, the avenger of blood. Now, if someone kills another individual unintentionally, then he could flee to one of the cities of refuge, and he could plead his cause there before the court of that city. If they found that his claim was true, then he had to remain in that city until the death of the high priest. If he went out of that city at any time, then the avenger of blood could execute him. And this was the balance that the law of Moses attempted to give in reference to the person who kills someone unintentionally compared to the person who kills another person in vengeance. This was something that was very different from the pagan nations that were around Israel. The Canaanites, for example, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Midianites, and so forth. All of these various various nations and tribes of people and all, human life was not very important to them. They killed one another for a number of reasons, and sometimes for no reason. Now, they had laws protecting people, of course. There was something called the Code of Hammurabi. Hammurabi was a Babylonian king who ruled back in the 1500s, the 1600s. Not exactly sure just exactly when he ruled, but he made a code. This code is it's a cylinder of black stone, basalt stone, and it stands about between 6 and 8 feet high. There are replicas of this stone, by the way, in museums all over the world. When I was in London, I saw one there. When I was in some other cities, I've seen these replicas of the Code of Hammurabi, and it's written, of course, in cuneiform, the old script of the Babylonian people, and people who study these things have been able to translate it, and there are a lot of similarities between the Code of Hammurabi and the Law of Moses. A number of similarities, not identical, but one of the things that, in reference to this particular commandment, one of the things that was kind of interesting to me was that in the Code of Hammurabi and the Law of Moses, both of them deal with an intruder. Under the Law of Moses, if an intruder broke into your house at night, you could kill him, and you would not be guilty of murder. However, after dawn came, under the Law of Moses, you were not allowed to kill him. You could capture him, he could be arrested, so to speak, but you could not kill him. Now, in the Code of Hammurabi, you could kill him anytime. If an intruder came in, it was your right to kill him. And because, you see, the pagan nations did not put as much emphasis on the sanctity of human life as God placed on it. We have to remember that in the early part of Genesis, the creation story in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, God created man in his own image. Man was not like an animal. Man is not just a grown-up, evolved animal. Man is created in God's own image. And so there's a sanctity here to human life that was very important in the Hebrew, among the Hebrew, the Israelite people. Why was this true? Well, this really gets into the next commandment, because there's a link here in reference to why these things were true. They thought of the gods and goddesses as being in competition with each other. And sometimes the gods and goddesses would war against each other, and some of the gods would be killed. And there were all kinds of things like this. And, people become like the God that they really worship. That's the reason that Paul said, beware of idolatry. Beware of covetousness, which is idolatry. We'll get to covetousness in just a few moments. But the whole idea was that Paul was saying is, you become like the God that you worship. And if you worship things, you will become a materialist. If you worship other people, you will become attached to them, and that becomes first place in your life. But if you worship the true and living God, and you really worship Him, you adore Him, you're devoted to Him, and so forth, you tend to become like He is. And so the Bible describes Him as a God of holiness. So the commandment against murder is a commandment which has to do with the importance, simply, of human life. Human life, in the eyes of God, is a sacred entity. The next commandment that we have is, thou shalt not commit adultery. Well, we're probably saying to ourselves, yes, and that doesn't apply to me either. The relationships of human beings, male to female, is described in the Bible again as a sanctified relationship. One of the dangers that I see in our own culture, our own society, is that the politicians that have gotten themselves into trouble with people other than their own spouse. It has happened over and over and over and over. This is not good. You ought not to do this. Have you heard anybody say this is evil, it's sinful, it's immoral? No, those things are so unpopular. It's just ill-advised. It's infidelity to your wife or your husband, but very little is said about the fact that it's an immoral thing. Why would this be something of particular importance among the Hebrew people? Well, this connects with the previous one. I mentioned to you that there were similarities and the gods fought with each other a moment ago. Well, there was a strange thing that took place particularly in the Middle Eastern, among the Middle Eastern gods and goddesses. You know as well as I do, it doesn't happen so much in Southern California, but it happens in the colder and northern states and so forth. In the fall, everything turns brown, doesn't it? The leaves fall off the trees, the grass, in a lot of places, the grass dies, and you know, it just looks like everything's dead. Well, the pagans, the Baal worshippers in particular, they had an idea that the god that controlled rain and storms and so forth, that god got killed. And that's the reason that everything is dying out. And then there was a war, and Mot, who was supposed to be the god of death, Mot was overcome, and then Baal was raised back to life. Well, what is that? That's when springtime comes. And the trees begin blooming again, and the leaves come out, and things turn green. Well, Baal had been raised. Baal was the god of rain and storms and the god of fertility. Now, when we think of fertility, we think of the soil, we think of the animals, but we also think of mankind, and that's exactly the way these people thought. And so they had all kinds of fertility rites that the gods and goddesses were supposedly taking part in once a year. And so they had sometimes public displays of all kinds of sexual acts. And this involved the priest and the priestess many times among the pagan people. And so this whole idea, one reason that Israel got into so much trouble with these nations around was that there were some things very attractive in the looseness of their fertility rites. And so Israel began borrowing some of those ideas. It's called cultural borrowing. They began borrowing some of those ideas, and the first thing you know, they're worshiping their gods. And they worshiped Baal and the Ashtoreth and the Ashtoreth, and they worshiped Moloch at one time, and all sorts of things like this, because there were things in that were so attractive. And so one of the 10 Commandments is, thou shalt not commit adultery. Adultery is defined as a sexual relationship between two people, one of whom at least is married to someone else. Now, Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, you've heard it was said by them of old time, thou shalt not commit adultery. But I want to tell you something. He says, the one who looks on a woman to lust after her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now, this has been a confusing thing to some people, and I think wrongly interpreted. Jesus is not talking about the sexual desires that God placed within us. Every person who is thinking about getting married is thinking of the desire that he or she has for a sexual relationship. There's nothing wrong with that. Jesus is talking about the desire to commit a sin, to commit adultery. And so we need to be sure that we keep these two ideas separated. There is the purity of a sexual desire, which is perfectly right, perfectly normal, and every person has that. Then there's the person who says, he sees a woman. Yes, I know she's married. I don't care. I would really like to have a sexual relationship with that woman. Now you see there's a difference there. Here is someone who says, I want to commit a sin. I am willing to satisfy my own desires by committing a sin. The person who is planning to get married is saying, yes, I have that sexual desire, but I'm not willing to commit a sin to satisfy it. Instead, I will marry that person. There's quite a difference here. And so Jesus says that the person who looks upon a woman to desire to commit adultery, he says, he's already done it in his heart. So this is something that goes right along with the commandment against murder. Jesus says in adultery and murder also, he says, you know what? Before you do the overt act of murder or adultery, something is going on in your own heart, in your own mind. And that's hatred or an inordinate desire to commit a sin, to satisfy your own personal desires. So, Jesus deals here with the heart of a person. It doesn't mean that the Old Testament didn't deal with that. Jesus was reminding them of the fact that I want you to be pure in your soul, pure in your being, pure in your heart. If you do that, the overt act is never going to take place. The next one is, thou shalt not steal. This is a strange one to me. Today, if you steal something small, it didn't amount to anything much. It was only worth $1. And so petty thievery like this, even among children, petty thievery like this, oh yeah, you ought not to do that. But the whole idea of thou shalt not steal is to respect the property of other people, not in reference to how big that property is. It may be something very small. I've told you this story before, but I'm going to tell it again because it illustrates a point, I think, that's very important. When I was just a little guy, there were no fences between properties, by the way, when I was growing up. When I was just a little fella, I was playing in the yard of the people behind us, and I found a little safety pin in the yard. And I picked it up, and I took it home. And my mother saw that I had this little safety pin in my hand, and it didn't amount to very much. She says, where'd you get that? I said, over at Joe Bill's house. She said, take it back, it's not yours. Now, I remembered that. I'm 87 years old now, and I was about 4 years old, I guess, probably when that happened. So that was quite a few years ago, okay? But I remembered it. The sanctity of the property of someone else. Basically, it says, I have worked for this. I have purchased it. I have earned it. It belongs to me. And you do not have any right to it without my permission. Now, we need to remember that in reference to things that are small or things that are large. Didn't Jesus say, the one who is faithful over a few things will be faithful over many things? And so there is a principle here that's very, very important, and that is that we don't take things that don't belong to us. Let me tell you another story, just very, very frankly, I just remembered just now. And please, those of you who know me will understand. I'm not trying to exalt myself, but it's so real, and it works. I went to buy a camera for my wife. Down here on Victory Boulevard, there used to be a big developing outfit. I forgot the name of it now, many years ago. And I went in there and I asked them, I knew the camera that I wanted for her. And it was not just really expensive. It was about a $50 camera, something like that. And well, in those days, that was a little expensive maybe. But she brought the camera out, and I said, how much is it? And she said, it's $24.95. I said, no, that couldn't be. She said, yeah, that's what it is. I said, I've seen them on sale down in the mall, and nowhere's closed. And she said, yeah, Mr. Burch, that's it. I did business with them there. She said, that's what it is. And she went back and looked something up. She came back and she said, yes, this is the camera. So I paid her the $24.95, and I took the camera. And the next time I went in, I asked her about that. I said, are you really sure that camera was only $24.95? And I looked up the wrong camera, Mr. Burch. But she says, I talked to my boss, and it's okay. I said, you had to pay for it. She said, oh, no, I didn't have to pay for it. And I said, how much was it? She told me how much it was. And I took my wallet out, and I paid her for it. And she said, no, you don't have to. That's okay. I made the mistake. That's okay. I said, take the money. This is what it's supposed to cost. And I want you to do this. And she took the money. But you know what? She remembered that, not because I was such a great guy, but she remembered that because here was an honest person. We need to create among our friends and business people, we need to create an idea that we can be trusted. We are honest. Honest in the little thing. Honest whether it's to our advantage or to our disadvantage. There are just so many times when this becomes just a real important issue in life. This is related very, very much to the next commandment. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Actually, the way this is phrased, it has to do with witness in a court. It has to do with the fact that you do not present false testimony in a court. Now, this commandment against thievery says something about honesty. The commandment against bearing false witness says something about what we call perjury. It's kind of interesting that the New Testament says, look, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Do I have to take an oath? Do I have to say to somebody, well, yes, I know I said that, but I was not under oath. So what? You're supposed to tell the truth only when you're under oath? Only when you're under the penalty of perjury? No, the Christian is to tell the truth all the time. We talk about big lies and little lies. The little lies don't make much difference. It's the big lies that are really bad. They're the black lies. And then the little lies are little white lies, They're not so bad. Oh, children tell lies to their friends, and business people tell lies to customers, and this is just little stuff, Doesn't amount to anything very much. No, it does amount to something. Because it says something about the integrity of the person. The integrity in the heart of the person. If you can't be trusted in some little things, can you be trusted in some big things? If I can't be trusted in reference to something that's $1, and I have the chance to get something by a little white lie, I can get something that's worth $500, then can I go ahead and do that? Well, you see, once I cross that threshold of integrity, whether it's in big or little, once I cross that threshold, I have surrendered something. And you know, I'm not a psychologist. I don't know anything much about psychology, but I do know this, that a lie, when I tell a lie, I put myself into the realm of non-reality. Non-reality. I am dealing with something that does not exist. I'm dealing with a value that does not exist, but I'm treating it as if it does exist. And so the whole idea of integrity is extremely important. There was a friend of mine back in Tampa, Florida. He was the general foreman of the American Can Company factory down there. He had been an office boy, worked himself up all through the ranks. He established himself as a person of integrity among his friends. And then he became part of management. Well, they had a big labor dispute. This is a true story. They had a big labor dispute. And management said this and labor said that, and they just had, they were misrepresenting everything. And finally, one of the men who was representing labor, he said, "We are not going to believe anything that management says unless Wendell Strickland says it's true." How about them apples? You see, he had established himself. He had established his integrity. They trusted him. And this commandment here about false witnessing, it really stretches far beyond just the legal idea. It stretches far beyond, and it says, let your yes be yes, and let your no be no. And anything less than that is of the evil one, Jesus says. And finally, we have the commandment, do not covet. The commandment, do not covet, is an elusive commandment because we don't really know what coveting is. When I was growing up, and even after I was grown, I still just really didn't know exactly what coveting was because, well, we don't use that word very much. But I was told that to covet something, to violate this and covet something was when Rudy has something that I want and I do something wrong to get it. That's coveting. Yeah, that's coveting, all right. But coveting starts way this side of that. The word literally means greed. He says, you shall not be greedy. If we put it in colloquial terms, that's the way we would say, you shall not be greedy. Now, doesn't this bring it down kind of into the living room instead of having it out there floating around in the air somewhere that we don't really, a word that we don't really use? He says, don't be greedy. Mine, 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 mine. Little children sometimes learn greed from their parents because they see their parents grabbing and grabbing and grabbing. I want this, I want this, I want this, and the first thing you know, everything centers around what I want. And little children need to be taught as they grow up and as these values are forming, they need to be taught the idea of sharing. Share what you have. I don't want to share it, it's mine. Where did they learn that? Probably from their parents. So the idea of do not covet. And then he goes on and says, don't covet your neighbor's things, not even members of your neighbor's family. Don't covet his assets, his animals. his family, his wife, the things that he owned. Don't be greedy toward those things. Yes, I might see somebody that has something that I don't have, and I say to myself, I really wish I had one of those. But you see, greed says that my desire for that becomes a controlling factor in my life. I need to remember that greed, selfishness, self-centeredness, these things are related to each other, that gets me into all kinds of trouble. Tell me something. Why do thieves rob banks? Greed. Greed. Why do people steal things? Greed. It's at the root of so many things. And so the Bible simply says, do not covet. Do not be a greedy person. Well, the 10 Commandments. 10 rules for us to abide by. 10 ideas for us to embrace. 10 commandments for us to observe. They're commandments that deal with the relationship of human beings to God. Don't have any other God before me. Don't make any graven images. Don't bow down to them or serve them. Remember the Sabbath day. We talked about those. And then honor children, honor your parents. Don't commit adultery. Don't steal. Don't bear false witness. All of these things together, I think we neglect investigating the 10 Commandments the way we need to, because they get to the core of our being. And so I suggest that we spend time contemplating the restrictions of the 10 Commandments, the thou shalt nots, that need to help control our lives. If you're not a Christian tonight, we're going to sing an invitation song. And if you're subject to the invitation in any way at all, we invite you to respond. Let's stand together and sing.